Marcus Bennett returned from vacation to chaos. Police sirens blazed across his driveway, while Officer Eric Sloan ordered his family out, tossing their belongings onto the lawn as if they were intruders. Rachel's voice shook with fury. Naomi clutched her journal in fear, and every proof of ownership was mocked and ignored. But Marcus carried a truth powerful enough to shatter their prejudice in an instant. What will happen when a racist eviction collides with the hidden authority of the city's own mayor? If this moment stirs you, hit like and share to let others feel the shock. Now let's step into the full story. I remember the light first late afternoon, gold sliding across Maple Ridge Drive, when the black SUV turned into the Bennett's driveway and hit the brakes hard. The neighborhood was quiet enough to hear a dog 2 streets over. Then the sirens bled through the silence. 3 cruisers sitting on the lawn like they owned the grass, red and blue strobes bouncing off the Bennett's windows. Officers were already in the doorway, moving in and out with armloads of things that didn't belong to them. I saw Naomi's piano bench first crooked on the grass like a wounded leg. A framed wedding photo followed the glass catching a shard of sun before an officer set it down face up in the dirt. Someone tossed out folded quilts that still looked warm, the kind of soft you save for company or Christmas morning. It felt wrong the way a wrong note feels instant, undeniable. Marcus Bennett stepped from the driver's seat with the calm of a man who's used to bad news arriving in public. He reached back to help Rachel out. She kept a hand on the door to steady herself. Naomi stayed in the back, pressed to the window eyes, tracking the officers like she was trying to count how many hands were on her life. The lead cop, later I learned his name was Officer Eric Sloan, cut across the lawn, jaw-tight buzz, cut sharp enough to draw blood. "Sir, this is an active eviction. You need to move along." Marcus lifted his keys like a flag of truce, a little breathless but measured. "This is our home. We just returned from vacation." Sloan didn't glance at the keys. He looked past them the way you look past a flyer on a telephone pole. "We received a report of suspicious activity. Multiple individuals removing items." It was the tone more than the words. The kind of tone that turns a neighbor into a suspect before the first question's asked. Rachel's fingers found Marcus's sleeve and stayed there, white at the knuckles. Naomi blinked fast, eyes shining, as an officer carried her piano music, loose pages like junk mail. I stepped closer to my mailbox and then stopped. "You learn living where I've lived when to move and when to stay still." Marcus took a breath, not the dramatic kind, just the kind you take before you carry a heavy box. "Officer, he said there's been a mistake. We can show you Sir Sloan cut and flat, and final, this is an active scene." Another officer, young, trying too hard to fill his uniform, came up the driveway with his hand already on his cuffs. "Stay back or you'll be detained." His voice cracked on detained, but his hand didn't waver. That was the moment the house changed shapes. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a border. The porch was a checkpoint. The lawn was no man's land, scattered with the landmarks of a family, a photograph, a quilt, a stack of piano sheets breathing in the breeze. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He angled his body toward Rachel, kept Naomi in his line of sight, and spoke like a man who's had practice turning heat into light. "We live here," he said. 8 years. Our names are on the deed. We just landed. Our bags are still in the car." Sloane's eyes did a quick sweep of the SUV, then the house, then Marcus again, as if the facts themselves were suspicious for showing up all at once. Behind him, 2 officers stepped out with a plastic bin labeled winter. Someone's handwriting. Someone's life sorted into seasons. Rachel found her voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried. "Please. That's our daughter's piano. You can see the pictures on the wall through the window. That's us." Sloan barely turned his head. "Ma'am, the caller was very specific about what they saw inside. We're securing the property." "Inside." The word landed with a thud. How does a stranger get specific about the inside of your house? I looked up at Margaret Holt's place 3 doors down, blinds tilted just enough for a sliver of street. The kind of tilt that says concerned citizen on paper and something smaller out loud. Naomi eased the car door open, and for a second she was just a kid again, sneakers on concrete, sunlight in her hair. "That's my piano," she said, voice shaking but clear. "You can't." Sloan snapped, reflex quick. "Let the adults handle this." The words weren't a shout, but they shoved just the same. Marcus raised a hand, not to the officers, to his daughter. "A check, a signal. A promise I've got you." He took one step forward and the young officer's cuffs flashed again. "Sir," the young one warned, "I said stay back." "On what grounds?" Marcus asked. Not angry, not pleading, just the question a person asks when the rules are supposed to work the same for everyone. Sloan answered the way a door answers a knock when no one's home. "Report of suspicious activity." Rachel turned her face away for a second, the kind of turn you make to swallow what you don't want anyone to see. When she looked back, her eyes were dry and her voice had a layer of steel. "You are taking our belongings out of our home. Where is your order?" The officers kept moving. A lamp, a stack of books, a box of photographs that made a soft sound when it hit the grass like memory exhaling. I could hear my own heartbeat, then the way you do at the dentist, loud in your ears for no good reason, except that your body knows when it's under a light. Sloan gestured toward the door. "We'll be conducting a full check. Once we verify what Marcus asked." He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to win an audience. It was a man's voice when the bottom string of the guitar is tuned too tight and you pluck it anyway. That we belong where we live. The young officer shifted his weight shoes, scuffing the concrete. "Sir, stay back or you'll be detained." Sloan repeated this time like a ritual. A breeze pushed through the yard and lifted the corner of the wedding photo. In the glass for a second, all of us were in it. The officers, the neighbors, the man with the keys, the woman with the steel voice, the girl with the piano. The picture didn't care who was right. It just reflected what stood in front of it. Marcus lowered his keys, not in surrender, in calculation. "I recognized it the way you count to 3 in your head before you speak." He angled his words so only the people who needed to hear them did. Rachel stayed close to Naomi, then to Sloan, steady as a crosswalk light. "We'll cooperate, but you will not damage our property, and you will not lay hands on my family." A beat passed. Another. Somewhere a screen door clicked shut. The young officer's hand stayed on the cuffs. The threat hung there like summer thunder, not yet a storm, already electricity. That's how it began, not with a siren, but with a sentence. Not with shouting, but with the quiet stubbornness of a man standing on his own front step, holding the proof of his life in his hand, while strangers carried the rest to the grass. And all of us on porches, behind blinds, beside mailboxes, watched as a home tried to prove it was a home. They didn't argue first. They documented. Marcus opened the glove compartment, pulled out a neat folder, and laid it across the SUV's hood like a case file. "Deed," he said quietly. "Mortgage statements, property tax receipts, my city ID." He slid out passports with fresh airport stickers, boarding passes still warm from the terminal printer, a return ticket stamped with today's date. He wasn't grandstanding. He was doing what you do when the ground shifts, naming the facts out loud so they don't fall through the cracks. Officer Sloan gave it all a sideways glance, the kind you give a menu when you already know what you're ordering. Anyone could prepare those documents, he said, voice, even eyes already moving past the papers toward the front door. Click, click, click. That was the rhythm, now camera shutters and the chirp of radio's officers talking over each other in short official bursts. The house sounded like a newsroom and a locker room at once. Boots went up and down the porch steps, quick and purposeful. The lawn gathered objects the way the ocean gathers driftwood, a lampshade, a stack of mail, a tangle of extension cords, a cardboard box labeled winter in someone's careful handwriting. The ordinary had been rearranged into evidence. Rachel stepped closer to the hood, her palm flat against the folder, to keep the wind from lifting it. Her voice stayed low, but it had the temperature of steel. "We've lived here for 8 years. Ask our neighbors. They've seen Naomi practicing piano since she was 9. Sloan didn't look at Rachel when he answered. He aimed his words toward the middle distance. The caller was very specific about movements inside the house. He tapped his radio. "We are securing the property, inside." There it was again. The words sat there like a coin on a table. How did a stranger get so specific about the inside of someone else's home? Across the street, a garage door eased shut. On the sidewalk, 2 teenagers pretended to tie shoelaces while their phones filmed. A man I'd never spoken to lifted his camera high and held it that way, arms locked, not blinking. Faces gathered at windows, the kind of faces that say more by not saying anything at all. The silence wasn't empty, it was a verdict. It pressed against the scene until you could feel it on your skin. Naomi opened the back door and stepped out like someone exiting a church pew, careful, respectful of the space she was entering, already bracing for what waited. She kept both hands visible the way kids are taught now, and spoke with a tremor she tried to iron flat. "Officer, that's my piano. Those are our quilts. We just got back. We can show you the luggage." "Let the adults handle this," Sloan cut in crisp as a paper cut. The words landed meaner than a shout. Naomi's mouth closed around the rest of her sentence. She swallowed something I wish she didn't have to swallow at 17. Rachel's jaw set. Marcus lifted a hand a fraction, not to stop his daughter, but to hold her in place without touching her like a lighthouse does, steady present, guiding by being there. Sloan flipped a page on his clipboard pen, ticking boxes like a metronome. Report indicates multiple individuals removing items between 1,300 and 1,500 hours, he recited. Caller observed activity consistent with burglary. Observed through what Rachel asked. Binoculars. A conscience. I saw Sloan's eyes flicker, a half-second twitch that might have been irritation or might have been effort keeping the mask on, takes muscle. He ignored the question. Another officer came down the steps carrying a picture frame wrapped in brown paper like a present. When he set it on the grass, the paper tore, and a sliver of the photo showed through Marcus and Rachel on a beach sun behind them, Naomi between all three squinting into happiness. It felt indecent the way a hospital gown slips. Marcus picked up the boarding passes again. "We landed an hour ago," he said. "We came straight here. My assistant can verify the itinerary. The city car dropped us at the airport when we left. Sir Sloan said you can provide statements later." "Later we won't have our things," Rachel answered. The radios kept up their chatter. Words like clear, copy, confirm. It was language designed to sound neutral, and somehow that made it worse. Neutral in moments like this leans toward whoever has the most uniforms. A neighbor I recognized from the block party last summer drifted to the edge of the driveway. He lifted his phone, started streaming, and narrated in a low voice the way people narrate a sunset. "This is happening right now on Maple Ridge," he whispered. "They're evicting the Bennetts." He didn't call out to Marcus by name. He didn't call out to anyone. Marcus saw him. He didn't say hello. There's a kind of loneliness that arrives not when you're alone, but when you're surrounded and unseen. He put the passports away like he was tucking a child into bed. Careful, careful, then closed the folder and slid it back toward the windshield, saving it for a world that might want proof. "Officer Sloan," he tried again, gentler than I would have managed. "There's an easy way to end this. Walk with me and I'll show you family photos on the wall. Walk with me and I'll open every door." Sloan's chin lifted by degrees. "We'll handle the interior," he said. "You remain outside." "Outside," Marcus repeated, tasting the word. He looked at the porch. His porch now a border. He nodded once, not in agreement, in comprehension. He understood exactly the game being played. Rachel leaned in just enough that only we nearby could hear. "Marcus," she whispered Naomi. He shifted so both of them were inside the arc of his shoulder. He squeezed Rachel's fingers, and she didn't shake him off. She squeezed back. Naomi stepped a half pace closer and let the side of her arm brush his. It wasn't a huddle, it was a formation. An officer's camera flashed, the light popped white against the piano keys. Inventorying property, he announced to no one and to the record that would later pretend to be impartial. Rachel tried one more time, calm carved out of chaos. "You can see our family portraits from the sidewalk," she said. "We aren't hiding anything." The caller was very specific about movements inside the house, Sloan repeated, as if saying it again turned it into law. I looked down the street toward Margaret Holt's blinds, same sliver of street showing same polite angle of concern. It's a funny thing how worry can look like care until you're the one it's pointed at. "Sir," the young officer with the cuffs said again, defaulting to script, "Please remain where you are." Marcus did. He remained exactly where he was, on his property in his life, holding fast to the two people the scene wasn't built to hold. He inhaled once, steadying, then let it out through his nose like a runner, settling into stride. "All right," he said, not surrendering, recalibrating. "We will not interfere. We will not escalate. But you will treat our home and our family with respect." No one answered. The house did. It answered with another shutter click, another radio chirp, another pair of boots stomping past a framed photo that had been a secret until a stranger decided it wasn't. And in that thicket of noise, the Bennetts did the one thing that didn't make any sound at all. They stayed together shoulder to shoulder, 3 points that made a line that meant no. The radios never stopped. They pulsed like a second heartbeat over the yard, short bursts of static and code. Then Officer Eric Sloan pressed his shoulder mic and spoke a sentence that chilled the air more than the siren lights ever could. "Suspects remain on scene," he said, eyes on his clipboard, uncooperative. The word suspects felt like a gavel drop. It wasn't a description, it was a verdict. I watched Marcus straighten his back the way someone does when every muscle wants to argue, but their mind insists on staying level. Officer Sloan Marcus said, voice steady, "What about our behavior is uncooperative? We've answered every question. We've offered proof of ownership. We've stayed calm while our home is turned upside down." If Sloan heard him, you couldn't tell. His eyes stayed on the page pen, scratching as if the paper itself were more alive than the family standing 3 feet away. Naomi stepped forward, then a small movement with a big sound. "You can't treat us like criminals," she said, her voice carrying clean and bright through the still air. "We belong here." Across the street, someone lowered their phone, suddenly unsure whether to keep recording. Even the breeze paused. Sloan finally looked up. The muscles in his jaw shifted once, like he was biting back words, or maybe deciding which ones would sting more. His brow tightened in a way that wasn't just concentration, it was challenge. Before anyone could speak, a younger officer came up fast from the porch, camera raised. The lens was inches from Naomi's face before she had time to blink. She flinched back on instinct, heart hammering so loud I swear I heard it. Marcus's hand lifted halfway, a silent shield. "Documentation," the younger officer muttered, clicking off a shot that sounded louder than it should. The moment was thin ice. One wrong move, and it would break. Marcus drew a slow breath, the kind you take when the room is full of glass. Sloan broke the silence with something quieter but heavier. He glanced toward the house, then back at his notes. "The caller described the inside perfectly," he said almost to himself. "It was just a line tossed like a pebble, but it landed like a stone in water. Inside perfectly." I felt the ripple before I heard Rachel's sharp inhale. How could a neighbor describe the inside perfectly unless they had been inside or wanted to be? Marcus's eyes shifted to Rachel, then to Naomi and back again. He didn't need to say what we all thought someone out there wasn't guessing. Someone knew. Rachel's fingers tightened on Marcus's sleeve. Naomi's breath caught a soft gasp she tried to swallow. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence a house makes when it realizes it's being hunted. Marcus finally spoke, each word deliberate. "Officer Sloan," he said low but clear, "are you telling me the person who called this in described our furniture?" "Our rooms," Sloan offered nothing but a neutral stare, and the radio on his shoulder hissed like a snake. Marcus turned to his wife and daughter, his face a study in calculation and quiet alarm. The look said what he didn't. "This isn't confusion anymore. This is design." Rachel nodded almost imperceptibly. Naomi stood closer, her back brushing her father's arm, eyes never leaving the officers. From where I stood, the whole scene seemed to tighten, as if the air itself had moved closer. The family wasn't just defending a house anymore. They were standing inside a trap someone else had drawn, and Marcus, still deliberate, unflinching, was beginning to see the shape of the hand that set it. Marcus stood perfectly still, but I could almost see the memories moving behind his eyes. Margaret Holt. Her name rose like a shape out of fog. She lived 3 doors down, a widow with a spotless driveway and curtains that never seemed to open more than a sliver. 8 years on the same street, and she'd barely offered a hello. When Naomi once invited school friends over for music practice, Margaret hadn't knocked on their door. She just stood across the hedge, arms folded, mouth a thin line of disapproval. Rachel must have seen the thought flicker across Marcus's face. "She never even knew our names," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief, "and now she accuses us of burglary." The words broke with equal parts anger and hurt. For Rachel, it wasn't only about a neighbor's cruelty. It was the humiliation of having her family's belonging questioned in front of silent witnesses. Marcus kept his eyes on the patrol cars, but his mind was working elsewhere. As mayor, he'd spent years watching how small resentments could be turned into something bigger, how a complaint about noise or a late trash pickup could be fed into rumors, then become political fuel. He understood better than most how prejudice didn't need evidence. It only needed an opening. Was Margaret's call just an old woman's suspicion, or was someone trying to use her bias to knock him off balance, maybe even damage his name in an election year? The street felt tighter with every passing minute. A dry autumn gust rattled the maple trees, lifting brittle leaves that scraped across the pavement like tiny warnings. Curtains along the block shifted and stilled again. One set familiar white lace at the end house moved just enough to reveal a shadow. The glass caught a quick gleam, then closed back to a narrow eye. You didn't need binoculars to know someone was watching. A pair of neighbors whispered near their porch, half hidden behind a railing. I couldn't catch their words, only the cadence short clipped a mix of curiosity and nerves. They kept glancing toward the Bennett's yard, then toward that lace curtain. It was the sound of speculation hardening into story. Naomi, standing close to her father, followed Marcus's gaze toward Margaret's house and lowered her voice. Dad, do you think? Marcus gave the smallest shake of his head. Not now. His hand found Rachel's for a second, a squeeze that was both reassurance and silent warning. Then movement cut through the uneasy quiet. A young officer jogged up the driveway. Breath-quick radio still clipped to his vest. He leaned toward Eric Sloan and spoke just above a whisper. Whatever he said wiped the boredom from Sloan's face. Sloan's straightened eyes narrowing. He gave a single nod and murmured back, Captain Pierce is on his way. The words dropped heavy into the chill. Captain Pierce, on his way. It wasn't just another officer coming to double-check forms. It was the kind of arrival that shifted the balance of the whole street. You could feel everyone register it, the neighbors on their porches, the kids pretending to tie their shoes, the Bennett standing like a single silhouette against the flashing lights. Marcus caught the phrase and held it in silence. His shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, as though preparing for the next storm. Whatever game had begun with Margaret Holt's phone call was far from over, and now a higher rank was walking straight into it. A fresh burst of sirens shattered the uneasy lull. Another patrol car barreled onto Maple Ridge Drive, lights slicing red and blue through the late afternoon haze. Tires squealed, radios crackled, and the quiet neighborhood suddenly felt like a perimeter under siege. Kids on bikes scattered to the sidewalks. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. Officer Eric Sloan stepped forward as if the backup were an invitation. Sir, he barked louder than before, you are obstructing an investigation. His right hand slid to the steel cuffs on his belt, the metal catching the pulsing lights. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a signal, a line in the air that said, next step is force. Marcus Bennett didn't flinch. He kept his shoulders square, one palm open at his side. We are not obstructing, he said evenly. We are standing on our own property. Before Sloan could reply, Naomi moved. 17 and shaking, she stepped out from the shelter of the SUV and planted herself between her father and the officer. This is our home, she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. You can't arrest him. For a second, everything slowed, the spinning lights, the muttering radios, even the neighbors' whispers. Rachel's breath caught, then hardened. She reached forward, one hand clamping Naomi's shoulder to steady her, the other raised like a quiet blade aimed at Sloan. The look she gave him could have cut through the coldest badge. You will not touch my family. The street inhaled sharply when a young officer on the porch misread Marcus's subtle shift just a step to shield his daughter, and his own hand went to the grip of his sidearm. A ripple of alarm rolled through the bystanders. Someone shouted, "Don't!" Another voice cried out from behind a phone camera. For an instant, it felt like a single spark could set off the whole scene. Marcus stayed motionless, his eyes never leaving Sloan's. When he spoke, the words were low, but carried like a bell through the tense silence. Call your commanding officer. Now. The command landed heavier than a shout. Sloan's jaw locked. Behind him, the younger officer froze, his palm still resting on the weapon, but no longer tightening. The only sound was the thin hiss of a radio and the distant hum of traffic beyond the block. Seconds stretched tight as piano wire. Sloan's breath flared once, then he took a single step back. The cuffs stayed on his belt. Around us, the air loosened just enough to breathe again. For the moment, violence had been held at the edge, but it was close enough that everyone on that street, from the officers to the neighbors behind their curtains, knew how narrow the margin had become. Captain Howard Pierce arrived like a change in weather. Mid-50s tall, the kind of posture that says he's spent a lifetime being watched. He stepped out of the cruiser, took in the scene, the furniture on the lawn, the officers on the porch, the family holding their ground, and nothing in his face gave away what he thought. Eric Sloan snapped to attention so fast his belt-clicked voice, dropping half an octave as he hurried through a report. Pierce listened without nodding. When Eric finished, Marcus spoke first, not loud, not small, just precise. "Captain, what legal order allows you to remove our belongings?" Pierce turned measured hands behind his back. "Proper legal channels will determine that he said each word sanded smooth." "That's not an order," Marcus replied. "That's a deferral." The air tightened again. A neighbor's wind chime gave a single nervous note and fell quiet. Pierce's eyes moved to the items scattered on the grass as if inventory could be done without bending down. He offered a careful line. "We received a detailed report. We have a responsibility to secure the premises while we verify." Marcus didn't blink. Secure or seize Pierce didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The lawn had answered already. Then Marcus asked the question that split the afternoon. "What proof would convince you that a black family belongs in its own home?" It wasn't a shout. It hit harder because it wasn't. Conversations on the sidewalk stopped in mid-whisper. A boy on a bike put his foot down and held still. Even the radios seemed to hesitate before their next burst of static. Pierce's mouth pressed thinner. You could see him choosing a response that wouldn't ignite the street. Before he could choose, Naomi moved in close to her father's voice, low and urgent. "Dad," she whispered, "the security cameras aren't working." She swallowed. "Someone disabled them." I felt that sentence in my teeth. Marcus turned just enough to catch Rachel's eyes, then Naomi's. "You're sure?" he asked. "The indicator light is dead," Naomi said. "The app can't connect. It was working before we left." The ground under the scene shifted barely, but enough that everyone with a phone sensed it and leaned in. A mistake could be argued with. A disabled camera was a different animal. Pierce heard it too. His gaze flicked to Eric, quick searching edge was something like irritation, then back to the family. "We'll note the report," he said, voice still even. "If there's tampering, it will be included." "It will be included," Marcus repeated. "But will it be stopped?" Pierce held the neutral line. "Our priority is safety and procedure." Whose safety, Rachel asked, and whose procedure? No one had an answer that didn't sound like a press release. Across the street, blinds tipped a few degrees. A neighbor lowered his phone, then lifted it again, as if he didn't want to miss the moment where the story would decide what kind of story it was. The quilt on the grass fluttered and settled, the pattern briefly matching the red-blue of the cruisers, then losing it. Marcus's phone buzzed. Once. Again. Then steady, insistent vibrations, back-to-back calls that made the glass tremble in his hand. He glanced down just long enough to see the caller ID City Hall. He silenced it. Then it rang again. Another call. Then another. Pierce noticed. He didn't comment, but the information filed somewhere behind his eyes. "Captain," Marcus said, returning his attention, "walk with me to the window. You can see our family photos from the sidewalk. The piano belongs to our daughter. The boxes are labeled by season. We are not strangers here." Pierce weighed that. "We will handle the interior," he repeated, a careful echo of Eric's earlier line, only smoother. "You'll remain outside while we sort this out." Marcus let the smallest breath go, the kind a runner takes at the top of a hill. Not to quit, but to reset. "We've cooperated," he said. "We will continue to. But you are on notice. Our home has been entered, our belongings removed, and now our security system appears compromised. That is not securing. That is exposure." Naomi's fingers tightened around her phone. Rachel kept one hand on Naomi's shoulder and the other on the edge of the SUV, as if anchoring her family to something that couldn't be carried to the lawn. Pierce shifted his stance. For a heartbeat, the command aura thinned, and a man peeked through the look of someone who has seen situations turn bad and knows how fast they can go there. He glanced at Eric again, and this time the look had a question in it. Eric stared past him, jaw locked like a student daring the teacher to call on him. A radio crackled. "Unit 6 status." Another voice replied, "Inventory in progress." The words sounded like a lid clamped on boiling water. Marcus's phone buzzed a fourth time. He let it ring out, then slid it into his jacket. He didn't announce who was calling. He didn't need to. The persistence said enough. Whatever power had been quiet up to now was getting impatient. Captain Marcus said, calm, returning to his voice like tide. I am asking plainly in front of witnesses, by what authority are you removing property from a residence without a warrant in hand? Pierce didn't blink. A call reporting criminal activity corroborated by observations on scene affords us discretion to secure and verify. And discretion, Marcus said, has a history. The word hung there full of all the times discretion had leaned the same way. Pierce let the silence stand rather than fight it. When he spoke again, it was to the young officer with the camera. Mind your distances, no unnecessary contact. It wasn't an apology, but it was a line drawn in a better place than the last one. Naomi turned her face toward the house, toward the dark oval, where a tiny red LED should have been blinking. Someone planned this, she whispered, not to be dramatic, just to be honest. None of us contradicted her. The wind moved through the maples and set the leaves whispering. Somewhere down the block, a screen door closed. The neighborhood, which had started the afternoon, pretending to mind its own business, was now an audience. And the stage lights were the strobes on the cruisers. Captain Pierce is on scene. Eric finally reported into his mic as if naming the moment could control it. But the moment was past his control. The next moves would not be decided by a clipboard. They would be decided by the question Marcus had planted, the dead eye of a camera that should have been alive, and the calls from City Hall that were ringing like a clock. For a long breath, Marcus didn't move. He stood with the weight of two different worlds on his shoulders, the quiet one where he was a husband and father trying to keep his family safe, and the public one where every word could ignite a headline. I could almost feel the questions crossing his mind. Do I protect them by staying silent, or by speaking so loudly no one can ignore us? Rachel's hand rested on his arm, a silent anchor. Naomi's eyes locked on his, wide but steady. That was the answer. Family first, truth next. Marcus inhaled once, deep and deliberate, and stepped forward into the circle of flashing lights and cameras. I am Mayor Marcus Bennett of this city, he said, each word slow and unshakable. This is my home, and this is an unlawful violation of our rights. The street froze. Eric Sloan blinked as if the sentence had knocked the air out of him. The younger officers exchanged quick, startled looks, hands half lowered from their gear belts. Across the street, neighbors who'd been live streaming lowered their phones as if they weren't sure the screen could hold what they were seeing. Even the wind seemed to hold back. Captain Pierce's jaw tightened. He adjusted his stance, buying a few seconds. But Marcus wasn't finished. I require, he continued, voice rising just enough to reach every porch and window, that every moment of this encounter be recorded and transmitted without delay to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Nothing here will be hidden. Nothing will be buried. The demand rolled down the block like a low thunderclap. Radios crackled, then went quiet as if the static itself was deciding which side to choose. From the far end of the street came a sudden rush of headlights. A news van swung to the curb tires, screeching. Two more followed. Doors banged open and camera crews spilled out long lenses already rising. Reporters jogged toward the Bennett's lawn, microphones lifted like spears of light. The scene shifted in an instant. Only minutes ago, Marcus was a homeowner pleading for recognition. Now he was a public official with a national audience. Every flash of a camera deepened the silence among the officers. Eric swallowed hard. His clipboard hung loose at his side. The younger cop with the camera kept looking from Marcus to Captain Pierce, waiting for a cue that wouldn't come. The balance of power had moved without making a sound. Marcus turned slightly, catching the red glow of a camera light on his face. Captain, he said, I expect your full cooperation. This department is now accountable to the public it serves. Pierce nodded once, a small, careful motion, but his eyes betrayed a flicker, something between calculation and unease. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally signaled to an officer on his left to begin logging the interaction on an official channel. Behind them, another young officer approached, his expression tight with something more than duty. He leaned close to Pierce's voice, barely above the buzz of the street. The call, he whispered, came from Margaret Holt. I watched the captain's face shift a fraction, just enough to catch it in the camera lights. Surprise first, then something darker like the quick shadow of recognition. He straightened, but the change lingered in his eyes. Marcus saw it too. He didn't press yet. He simply held the silence, letting the truth settle where everyone could feel it. The story had a name now, and the name lived only 3 doors away. Captain Pierce didn't announce it with a speech. He did it the way people tell the truth when there's no room left to hide. He squared his shoulders, faced the cameras and the family, and said, "The call originated from Margaret Holt, 3 houses down, former HOA board member." He paused as if the next part tasted bad. "She retained old floor plans from the HOA archives. That may explain her detailed description of the interior." The street made a sound, half gasp, half growl. You could feel a current run through the block like a cable had been plugged into the pavement. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Bring Mrs. Holt here," he said, voice calm, carrying. "She must answer to the community she endangered." Pierce didn't like it. I could see that in the pinch at the corners of his eyes. But he also understood the math of this moment: 3 news vans, a wall of phones, a mayor on his lawn. He sent an officer with a nod toward the end of the street. We all looked the same direction. The white lace curtain in Margaret's front window stirred, then went still. A minute later, her door opened, with the soft, careful sound of someone stepping into a picture they'd hoped to stay behind. Margaret Holt walked out like she was arriving at a church function, pressed cardigan pearls that caught the light, a little smile that didn't make it to her eyes. She kept her chin level as she crossed the sidewalk, but her gaze did what it always did, slid over people like they were furniture. She stopped where Pierce indicated and folded her hands at her waist. "Mrs. Holt," Pierce said, voice formal. Now that the microphones were inches away, "You placed a call reporting suspicious activity at the Bennett's residence." "I did," she answered, smooth as cream. "I just wanted to protect the neighborhood." There it was. 14 words, polished and harmless on the surface, barbed underneath. Rachel stepped forward before anyone else could fill the silence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 8 years as neighbors, she said, and you never spoke to us until today when you called the police on our home. Why? Margaret blinked fast the way you do when something lands closer than you expected. "I thought something was wrong," she said. "I saw movement, people carrying things. It didn't look right. People carrying their own things," Rachel said, gesturing to the lawn, to the wedding photo with a tear in the paper, to the quilts. "That didn't look right to you?" Margaret's eyes flicked toward the cameras, then away. "It looked unusual," she offered. "Unusual because we were away?" Marcus asked. "Or unusual because we live here?" a few of the neighbors murmured. Someone said, "That's enough," under their breath, but no one told who it was meant for. Phones rose higher. Across the curb, a reporter mouthed the words, "former HOA board member," to a producer and pointed toward the house numbers. Marcus kept the pressure where it belonged on the facts. "You gave a description of the inside of our home," he said. "How did you do that?" "Mrs. Holt, I served on the HOA," she answered. "We review plans and layouts for renovations. I kept a copy for records." "After you stepped down," Marcus said, not accusing, just labeling. "You kept a copy after you stepped down." "It's common," she said too fast. "For safety." "For whose safety?" Rachel asked. Margaret's mouth pinched. "For the neighborhood." The word hung there like a gate with only one side. Naomi spoke then, steady, not sharp. "Our security cameras were disabled. Did you know that Margaret's head tilted a centimeter?" "I don't know anything about cameras," she said, and for the first time her voice wasn't smooth. It had a burr in it. "I only called because I was concerned enough to know exactly where our living room sofa is," Rachel pressed. "Concerned enough to get 3 police cars to empty our house without a warrant?" A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. A man near me lowered his phone and said out loud this time, "This isn't concern." A woman across the street added, "It's harassment." Someone else said, "Say her name." And a small chorus answered, "Margaret Holt," not like a chant, more like a verdict. The cameras loved it. Lenses leaned in. Boom mics dipped. The whole thing felt like a trial with no judge, only witnesses. Margaret tried to reclaim the ground with the line that had worked for her at smaller tables. "I just wanted to protect the neighborhood," she repeated, softer, as if volume could turn the words into virtue. Rachel didn't move. "We are your neighborhood," she said. "My daughter's piano is your neighborhood. Our family photo is your neighborhood. Did you ever protect us?" Silence spread until even the radios respected it. You could hear a leaf scratch across the sidewalk and the tick of a cooling car engine. Pierce breathed out through his nose, the kind of breath that admits what the mouth won't. He looked from Margaret to the lawn, to the officers, to the cameras, then back to Marcus. In that small circuit, his face changed authority, slipping into accountability procedure, shading into consequence. He understood finally that this wasn't a tidy mistake. It was a map of how things work when suspicion finds the path of least resistance. "Mrs. Holt," he said formal again, "your statement will be taken under penalty of law. You will remain available for further questioning." Margaret nodded a tight, offended little nod, as if the inconvenience were the only wrong done today. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, it leaned forward. A boy on a bike rolled closer, foot dragging the asphalt with a soft hiss. A neighbor I'd never met whispered to her stream, "They kept the floor plans." They knew the inside. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He turned to Rachel and Naomi and let his palm rest just for a second on each of their shoulders. Then he faced the officers and the lenses again. His voice didn't rise. It deepened. "This," he said, "is how a family becomes a suspect. A bias, a copy of an old plan, a phone call, and a system that moves faster than the truth." Pierce's eyes flickered, then settled. He gave a short, weary nod that read like admission the storm had outgrown his umbrella. Whatever happened next would be bigger than his clipboard. At the end of the block, the lace curtain in Margaret's window fell still. On the Bennett's lawn, the wedding photo caught a blink of light and then went dull again, waiting for someone to pick it up and put it back where it belonged. They didn't pack up the cameras or the cuffs first. They packed up the lies. Marcus stepped forward not to grandstand, but the way a surgeon steps to the table, sure of what must be done. "Here is how this proceeds," he said, voice calm enough to cut. "Internal Affairs will open a full investigation tonight. The city attorney will coordinate with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. A civil action will be filed against Margaret Holt for a false report, and the department will be held accountable for unlawful removal of property in violation of due process." No one cheered. The street just listened the way you listen when a verdict is about to be read. Captain Pierce squared to the cameras. If fatigue had a sound, it would be his exhale. Effective immediately, he said, each syllable measured for the record. "Officer Eric Sloan is suspended pending federal investigation." He didn't look at Sloan when he said it. He looked at Marcus then, at the lawn, as if the mess there was the true subject. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The phones lifted higher. Somewhere behind me, a neighbor whispered, "It's happening." Another said, "About time." The officers began carrying items back inside, lamps first, then boxes slower, now careful in a way they hadn't been when they were removing them. Marcus nodded once to Pierce, nothing like gratitude, more like acknowledgement that a door had finally cracked open. When the threshold cleared, Rachel took Naomi by the hand and they stepped into the house. A minute later, I heard Rachel call softly, sharp enough to summon, soft enough to spare. Marcus went in. The cameras stayed on the grass, but every lens stretched toward the doorway like it had a neck. Naomi stood in the hall holding a small book to her chest, the way people hold heirlooms during fires. The lock on the journal dangled, broken, a cheap brass mouth pried wide. Pages were bent like wings mid-beat. She didn't cry. She looked furious, older by a year than 5. "They went through my writing," she said, voice flat with disbelief. "They read my life." Rachel wrapped her arms around her daughter. "Not a shelter, a brace." "They cannot break who we are," she said, low and steady. "Not our home, not our daughter." Out on the curb, the internet found the story. Streams multiplied, stitched, captioned, cut into clips with overlays and timestamps. A national outlet pushed a banner, "Mayor's family mistakenly evicted by police caller identified as neighbor." Comments poured in like rain hitting hot pavement, hissing, rising, rolling downhill toward City Hall. Marcus didn't reach for a podium. He reached for Naomi's journal. He turned it gently, as if the care he showed its broken spine could be a counter-argument to everything that had happened outside. He looked up then, and I saw the moment his grief hardened into something heavier than anger. Resolve has a face. It was on his. He came back to the doorway so the street could hear him. "We will cooperate with investigators," he said. "But understand this, we will not accept apologies in place of accountability. Our home is not a stage for someone else's fear. Our child's words are not a crime scene." The line carried across porches and through screens. It landed in the cameras like a stake driven into ground that had been sliding all afternoon. Behind him, officers set a wedding photo back on its hook. A quilt was folded and placed on the couch. The music sheets for Naomi's piano were stacked not quite straight, but no longer on the grass. Captain Pierce gave a single nod, small, sober, almost human. Sloan stood off to the side, hollowed out by silence, his suspension heavier than his badge had looked an hour earlier. Rachel kept one hand on Naomi's shoulder. Marcus kept one hand on the ruined journal. And in Naomi's eyes, past the fury, past the hurt, I saw the thing that tells you a story isn't ending. It's changing not just pain, but purpose. A month later, Maple Ridge Drive looked different, and not just because the leaves had turned. At City Hall, a new law passed with more than the usual clapping of hands. The council voted to create a civilian oversight board with the power to subpoena, investigate, and recommend discipline, real authority, not the soft kind that used to vanish into committee rooms. It was the first time in the city's history that the police would no longer investigate themselves. Marcus Bennett stood at the podium beneath the city seal, the same calm presence he'd held on his front lawn, but now lit by television lights. Reporters packed the chamber wall to wall. These reforms, he said, his voice steady enough to quiet every shuffle of paper are not favors. They are constitutional rights. What happened to my family must protect every family in this city. The applause came slowly, then deepened until it filled the chamber like a tide. But Marcus didn't pause for it. He went on laying out the details: independent review, public reports, mandatory training, and a permanent seat for community members who'd long been left outside the door. He spoke less like a politician than a father who'd already paid the price for delay. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she didn't read from notes. 17 and sure-footed, now she stepped to the microphone and looked out at a crowd of neighbors, teachers, and classmates who had watched the story unfold on screens. We deserve to feel safe in our own homes again, she said. Not because of who we know or what title we hold, but because we are people. That's all it should take. Her words landed with the quiet power of something obvious finally spoken. A few officers in the back shifted uncomfortable, but no one left. Then a young uniformed man rose from a seat near the aisle. I recognized him from that night, the officer who had flinched when Marcus moved, the one who had hesitated with his hand on the gun. He introduced himself as Officer Daniel Rodriguez. His voice shook at first. That evening, he said, I saw things that didn't sit right. I stayed silent because that was the habit. Today, I'm saying out loud that silence was wrong. I'm committed to making sure our culture changes so no family stands where the Bennett stood. The room fell still. It wasn't the stillness of suspicion. It was the kind that comes when people feel a door opening. Weeks later, on a soft spring morning, I happened to walk Maple Ridge Drive again. The Bennett's black SUV was back from another short trip. This time the welcome was ordinary in the best way. Neighbors waved, a child rode past on a scooter. Someone's golden retriever bounded across the grass. No flashing lights, no blinds pulled tight. Just a street at peace with itself. Marcus stepped out first, setting a suitcase on the driveway. Rachel followed, and Naomi, taller, somehow swung her backpack over one shoulder. Marcus paused and let his gaze travel the block, over lawns and mailboxes, across the house where Margaret's curtains now hung wide and plain. Then he said the words he'd been living since that long night. From our driveway to City Hall, he said, voice low, but carrying justice will be the standard we live by. The sunrise caught the edges of the houses and turned them gold. For a moment, the whole street glowed like a promise, kept a promise that what began as violation had become something larger. A city choosing fairness over fear, and a family proving that courage can redraw the lines of home. What a journey this has been, from fear on a family's own driveway to real change for an entire city. Marcus, Rachel, and Naomi reminded us that courage and unity can turn pain into reform, and that justice is not a favor, but a right. Their stand proves that one voice backed by truth can reshape a system. If this story moved you, please like this video and share it with friends and family so the message of fairness and dignity can travel even further. And be sure to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories, where we keep bringing you powerful, true-to-life stories that spark hope and action. Your support is what fuels the heart of Mr. Max Stories, helping us create more meaningful narratives that honor justice and inspire change.